How does the game know if I have a gambling problem versus just a high risk tolerance? That cracked me up. Can you talk about that? Thank you for checking out Real Talk Personal Finance. Shit's about to get real. Cash Flow King with you today. And in today's episode, we have Aurum, Outsmart Money, Outplay the Game, featuring Lucy Taylor. I'm going to introduce Lucy to the show right now. In just a moment, we'll have her come on and we'll have a little bit of dialogue. As those of you that have listened to the show for some time probably know, we do get pitched, for lack of a better word, quite a bit from folks that are kind of wanting to get on the show. And historically speaking, we've really not been very receptive to that. I've actually had some fun sending some emails back and forth to people about reasons that we don't want them on the show. But with the theme of trying to accommodate more guests in 2026 and make this a show that is more conversational in nature and not so much me just talking to myself for an hour, we've decided to have more folks on, and we're very happy that Lucy decided to contact the show. So just a quick little bit about Lucy. Lucy Taylor is a student entrepreneur at the University of Austin and founding member of the UATX Alpha Fellowship. As part of the inaugural class, Lucy is passionate about innovation, both in education and entrepreneurship. She's been on the Fox News, The Will Cain Show, and other interviews to share how UATX and Aurum are challenging the status quo of universities and personal finance education. There's a little bit more, but I'm going to leave it there. Please welcome to the show for the very first time, Lucy Taylor. Lucy, thanks for coming to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Cash Flow King.
So this is really cool. So you're a student, right? Do you mind if I ask your age?
Yes, I'm 21 years old.
21. This is very impressive. So when you contacted the show, you mentioned something about kind of a flight simulator for personal finance. Hey, I'm not here to sell anything. I want to come on the show, and these are 3 different things that I wanted to discuss. You've sent me a sheet that has a little bit more information about several different items, which we'll get into over the course of our conversation today. But for the listeners that are like, what the heck is Aurum, and who is Lucy, and why is she on this show? Give us the Cliff Notes real quick. Like, what are you up to, and what do you do in the world?
All right, so I'm a student here at University of Austin, and as part of this new university kind of challenging the status quo of what education is supposed to be, I've been exposed to lots of different viewpoints on education in general. But specifically with personal finance, I've seen several issues with how personal finance is taught. It's boring, the methods are outdated, we're not using the tools that are at our disposal, and it's really not holistic or applied in any way to the individual's life. So I'm building Aurum, which, like I said, is a flight simulator for your financial life. We're aiming to let you fail in a safe environment and scaffold you into your real life finances. That way, most people fail in their personal finances in college, right when they start using a credit card, getting student loans, and then they fall into this trap of debt and several other bad financial decisions. We're here to stop that and let students learn in a behaviorally informed way in a safe environment, and then scaffold them into the real world where they can manage their finances holistically and in an applied way.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember when I was an undergrad, and luckily I didn't do this, because had I done this at the time, I probably would have made some pretty big mistakes. Unfortunately, I never did get into trouble with credit cards, but I remember, I won't say the name of the bank, but they were a pretty big bank that everybody would be familiar with. They literally had a stack of $5 bills and t-shirts, and they were right outside like the student area where we went into essentially the cafeteria to get food. And anybody that signed up for a credit card, you were given a free t-shirt and a $5 bill. And that was not enough to entice me at the time. Luckily, I didn't do that, but a lot of people, for one reason or another, have a tendency to get in trouble with credit cards, and that's just the start of it. But that seems to be a pretty big topic. So I think it's really cool that that you're doing this. So yeah, I guess to start off with here, and I don't know if you know this or saw this or not, but your website is aurumfinancial.app, app, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and I actually applied or submitted the show's information to join the wait list. I don't know if you saw that come through or not.
Yes.
But so we are on the wait list. So this is something that you're building currently. It's not yet launched. Is that right?
Correct. It's currently in the prototyping phase, and we're starting to do some beta testing and possibly launch another smaller product to just start out with and test the market, but it's currently in development.
Okay. All right. Very good. So some of the things on here you mentioned in one of your little suggested interview questions that we described, and you mentioned this too just a moment ago, describing Aurum as a flight simulator for wealth. And then the question that stems from that is, why would it be dangerous to learn finance without a simulator? And I think the answer is probably obvious, but if you want, shed some light on that for the listeners and how this might help them once it's launched.
Yeah, absolutely. So learning encompasses a lot of failure. Failure is very much a part of learning. And as I said earlier, with personal finance, a lot of people fail first in their 20s. They start to fail when it actually matters. But what we're trying to do is build a way to fail safely. And the only way that you can really do this is to build an applied but scaffolded way for the student to fail. So what does this look like specifically? Applied, meaning that they're doing this kind of in their real life, but it's under the jurisdiction of the game. It's supervised by educators, but it's scaffolded. They're not just going into the world and deciding, oh, I'm going to apply for a credit card and get a student loan and then fail and get in tens of thousands of dollars of debt. No, it's scaffolded. So we're kind of removing the constraints. We're removing the, as it were, like help as you start to become more competent. So the user will grow up, they'll demonstrate that they're better at something than they used to be, and then we'll start to remove those constraints and push them out into the real world gradually so they can build confidence while they're learning.
And who would this be designed for? Because there's probably people listening to this, let's say, that are, my audience is typically, from what I've been able to gather, and I don't know this with 100% certainty, but they're typically going to be young to mid-career individuals. So let's say somebody, for example, is in their mid-30s, let's say. Would this be something that would be good for them to use? Are we trying to get people started with it? Obviously, probably the younger the better, right? But who is this built for from kind of a demographic standpoint, if there is one?
Sure. So we have 3 different segments. We have Aurum Growth, which is the kind of game simulator, style that we're doing. And then we have Aurum Build, which is targeted at teens. So as they're starting to earn their first paycheck, maybe save up for a car, save up for college. And then we have Aurum Mastery, which is for adults. And so that is kind of like the holistic financial modeling, AI-driven simulation component. And that is targeted toward our older audience. But as far as demographic, I would say this is for people who are entrepreneurs. This is for people who don't want to just learn personal finance, learn to pay off all their credit cards, learn to save up in their 401k. This is for people who want to implement systems thinking in their financial life. So people who are looking at many, many different factors and looking to optimize all of them at once. This is who Aurum is for.
Okay. Before the show, you mentioned I had asked kind of where you found the show, and we were talking a little bit about it, and Projection Lab came up. And for those that aren't familiar, there's a link in the show notes. You guys can check it out. But that's something I think you said you were familiar with. How would this sort of interact, if you will, with something like a Projection Lab where you can run different types of simulations and scenarios and create plans? And, quite frankly, I even as an industry professional, I've started using Projection Lab because the software does some things that some of the tools we use in the workplace in my professional career, quite frankly, that I think it does better. But it is very technical, I think, for a lot of people, or it can be, and it's very, there's a lot of things you can do with it. I would imagine that Aurum is probably going to be more, I don't know if user-friendly is the right word, but something where maybe it's not as potentially difficult for somebody to navigate within that. So how would something, and it doesn't have to be specifically Projection Lab, but something like that, how would that integrate with something like Aurum?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, phase 3 will be that Projection Lab style interface. And I haven't done too much of the specifics of building it out, though it will be AI driven. That is the one thing for sure. I'm pretty sure Projection Lab is not currently using a whole lot of AI. And, with personal finance, there's so many factors. There's so much data at our disposal. And we're just not utilizing AI to its fullest potential in that regard. So it definitely will be more user-friendly. and possibly have, like an AI chatbot to connect you with financial advisors, other features like that I'm pretty sure Projection Lab does not have. But the AI will help streamline kind of the inputs, and it will help kind of project out in a more diverse simulation type of way than Projection Lab currently does.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't think that they're using anything with AI. I know there is a segment, because I poked around in there, where you can, if you wanted to, connect with an advisor. There really surprisingly weren't, maybe all that many people. I want to say it was probably sub 30 individuals, and this is not just in the U.S. but across the world that are using Projection Lab as advisors. So there's probably maybe an opportunity there for them to continue to grow that advisor base for those that want that kind of interaction. So you said something that struck me, and there's a couple things on this sheet here that I thought was pretty interesting here. One of the points that, and you've mentioned this a little bit today, about traditional advice is to pay off all debt, and then you argue that teaching kids to fear debt is actually setting them up for mediocrity. And so can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I think that's something that a lot of listeners, anyone that's listened to my show, probably knows my viewpoint and stance on debt in different scenarios, which probably, I'm guessing, we'll see here in a second, may align more closely with how you might describe it. But I'm certainly not the Dave Ramsey of the world, if you will, in terms of my thoughts on debt, specifically with businesses and real estate and things like that. But can you elaborate on that point, that teaching kids to fear debt is actually setting them up for mediocrity?
Yes, exactly. I'm so glad you brought up Dave Ramsey. This is that classic Dave Ramsey versus Robert Kiyosaki viewpoint on debt. And, Dave Ramsey says, cut up all your credit cards, pay off all your debt. I mean, he's clearly targeted at a subset of listeners that struggle with debt, that have gotten into bad credit card debt before, that almost like can't help themselves with regard to that. And so I think Dave Ramsey is a great starting point for people who are coming from that background. But as far as viewing debt as leverage, this is the most important thing with regard to debt that we want to kind of drive home, because a lot of students hear debt and they're like, oh no, that's bad. That means I owe more money than what I am essentially getting for it. But when you look at the holistic scope, I mean, everything about Aurum is supposed to be holistic and applied. And so when you look at, I'm sure you've heard, the average return on investments in the stock market is about 7%. And so if your debt is at a lower interest rate than that, and you're just paying it off, you're missing out on potential returns from other investments. So we really want to drive home the point that debt, yes, it's bad in that you're kind of spending more money. You're spending more money to gain access to more money. But if your investments are making more than what you're paying for your debt, and you're just paying off your debt, you're kind of losing liquidity in that. So we want to teach this holistic kind of business-oriented worldview, and not just saying debt is all debt is bad. Essentially, we want to say debt can be bad, but viewing debt as leverage in a business perspective can be a very powerful way to see it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Essentially positive financial arbitrage, right? I think, and I've talked about this on the show, I don't remember which episode it was, but I went on to talk about a car purchase I made last year, and I could have paid cash and written a check for it, but they had some promotional financing from the manufacturer. It's a decent rate, 3.99%, and it bothers me actually that I have that, but I know that maintaining liquidity and having those assets invested elsewhere that I'm going to earn more than, on average, 3.99%. I'm dollars ahead by doing that, even though sometimes it might feel or make somebody feel a certain way. And I think that the debt-free mindset for a lot of people would be, well, if you can pay cash, you should. And I'm a big believer in the phrase, just because you can doesn't mean you should, with regard to anything. But in this case, personal finance and, a situation like that. So is that kind of along the lines of what you're thinking here and what you're talking about, whether it's with real estate or business or even the personal purchase?
Yes, absolutely. I recently just got engaged, and we were looking at, do we finance the ring? Do we pay it in cash in full? And we were like, financing is free. Why not just, invest the money, keep it growing, and pay off the ring in, financing terms? So absolutely, I think that if your money can be working hard for you elsewhere, you should absolutely do that.
So I'm assuming you got like a 0% type of deal?
Yes.
Which, congratulations, by the way, on getting engaged.
Thank
That's
you.
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, so that's very cool. And he's been on here a bunch. Credit Union Cowboy is a big fan of the 0% financing world. And obviously, you need to be careful. I'm not saying this to you specifically, but you people out there, listeners, generally speaking, need to be aware of, and I'm assuming this was probably in some way, shape, or form where Aurum would come in the simulation and teaching people about these types of decisions, because a lot of times if it is 0%, and let's say they did have some sort of a minimum payment that needed to be made on it, by the end of that structured or scheduled term, they're usually designing it in such a way that it's not going to be completely paid off. And all that interest that was essentially accruing on the back end is just going to hit somebody all at once. You I'm almost for sure, you're aware of that. Most people, they don't realize that. They're going to pay something according to schedule, and then they're going to get hit on the back end. So would that be kind of a small example of a way that somehow Aurum would be able to teach the user about decisions like that and kind of take it full circle?
Yes, exactly. In sort of the game context that we're looking at this in, a trap that a lot of people would fall into is exactly what you said, just, not really paying it off in full, thinking that, oh, if I just go along with what they tell me to do, then I'll be fine. Well, what they're telling you to do is fall into the system so they can make money off of you. So we're really trying to teach that informed aspect where you're able to see not only how am I supposed to act, but how do these financial institutions make money? It's the same idea with credit cards. They want you to pay the minimum payment, so you get trapped in this debt cycle so that they can profit off of you.
Yeah, you mentioned that. I'm looking at your sheet here. It's a 2-pager, so there's a lot of stuff going on. But yeah, I'm pretty sure you mentioned on there how it can be financial services, or the world in general can be essentially predatory when it comes to stuff like that. And that's, I think, a pretty good example of how that could unfold for somebody, because if they're not aware of it, then all of a sudden they're stuck in this cycle. So you mentioned on here too, on the sheet, about under psychology and gamification, that by age 7, a child's money habits are largely set. And the follow-up question there is, okay, well, how does Aurum rewire a brain that has already learned bad habits? So that's an interesting one, because 7, we have an 18-month-old now, and it's years away, but 7 doesn't seem all that far away, and I'd like to think we'll be teaching her very good habits. But what comments do you have on that as far as Aurum and rewiring a brain and unlearning bad habits if needed?
For sure. This goes to show the importance of just-in-time financial education. So this is when the education is delivered at what's called a teachable moment, which is the time that decision is made. So for example, if you're teaching a high schooler about retirement, they're not going to be super engaged. They're like, oh, that's far off, whatever. But if you're teaching them about budgeting and saving up for their car and how they can make the most of their first job, that is actually a teachable moment for them. And so when I say that we need to rewire the brain at, this specific time, especially starting early, like by age 7, we need to start forming those connections at those teachable moments. And so I'm sure if you've done any research on kind of how learning happens, it's the connections in the brain that are made over a long period of time. And so these connections grow stronger as the person keeps practicing these habits. And so when you've kind of already built up these bad habits, we need to break them. And obviously that's easier said than done. And it's also easier to do earlier in life rather than later. So by age 7, they're already set, they're starting to get going. But what we're able to do through applied simulation is start rewiring the brain in a better direction through that applied simulation that I was talking about.
Gotcha. And you mentioned AI. We've talked about it a little bit on the show before about AI. We've talked briefly about it today. There's a point here, and I got a kick out of this. I wrote LOL next to it when I was prepping for the show, and I looked over your sheet. It says, explain the AI algorithm in Aurum, and how does the game know if I have a gambling problem versus just a high risk tolerance? That cracked me up. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So the AI that's currently in the game, it is not directly interfacing with the user, but it's constantly in the background. It's watching all of the user's decisions within the game as a holistic kind of guide. And so what it's able to see is, for example, if you have a high risk tolerance, let's say you make a highly volatile investment or choose a risky loan, but the AI sees you already have a fully funded emergency fund, a stable income, and a diversified portfolio. Because of this, it can log this as a calculated and strategic risk. On the other hand, let's say you have a gambling problem or poor impulse control. if you bet your avatar's rent money on a highly volatile asset out of desperation, or you consistently spend essential funds on high-risk ventures without building that safety net first, the AI will flag this as a behavioral vulnerability, and it will actually show that you have poor impulse control. Because we're using AI within this simulation and it's not just a standard lecture and test format, the AI is actually able to see kind of all of the behaviors within the game and log all of that data at once. So with AI, we're able to see and kind of analyze these behavioral patterns to know, does the user, have a gambling problem, or are they actually just taking calculated risks within the game?
Got it. I like to think I don't have a gambling problem, but I do like to gamble. Let's see here. All right. So you mentioned earlier on the show, I'm going to kind of, take this in not a different direction, but just kind of ask a few of my own questions here that aren't necessarily from the sheet. You mentioned Robert Kiyosaki, which tells me that you're very likely familiar with the Rich Dad, Poor Dad book and concept and the series of books and all that kind of stuff. It sounds to me like you're more in that school of thought than the Dave Ramsey, Susie Ormans of the world. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then how has that shaped what you are doing as an individual, as an investor? Like, talk to us a little bit about sort of your financial strategy and what types of things that you have done or are doing that maybe without that perspective could be a little bit different or may have been a little bit different.
Sure, I'll actually show, since I'm pretty young, I don't have a whole lot of track records with like my investments or anything like that, but I can talk about my upbringing. I have always been, I guess you could say, an entrepreneur. I started selling our chicken eggs at 5 years old. I would go around to the neighbors and sell them. I started an Amazon business at 10 years old, and then throughout high school, I had several other sort of e-commerce ventures. And so I grew up around entrepreneurialism. My parents are both entrepreneurs. And I saw this kind of from that, leverage, that holistic point of view. And I'm also a math person. I've always loved math. I've loved calculus, all the optimization problems and everything like that. And so taking those two things together, I think everyone should learn personal finance through entrepreneurialism the same way I did, because it teaches you how to view things from a systems thinking point of view. And so that, combined with my love for math and my love for optimization within finance specifically, kind of brought me to this standpoint that I'm at now. And that standpoint just happens to be the, entrepreneurialistic idea.
So is this something where, like, I know you're a student currently, are you planning on essentially launching this and making this sort of your full-time thing, or how are you thinking about Aurum? And it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the whole idea of being an employee is not appealing at all to you, right? So what is your plan, and what does that look like? Or am I wrong? Is it, hey, I'm building this, but I'm also going to go ahead and maybe do something else, or maybe you are, a W-2 or even a 1099 or something like that? What are your thoughts around things like that?
Sure, there's absolutely nothing wrong with being an employee. I've been an employee before. I might be an employee again. I think being an employee does not necessarily contradict with being an entrepreneur, at least in the mindset sort of things. With AI now and lots of automation and kind of instability in the workforce, I think it's paramount that everyone adopt an entrepreneurial mindset rather than let me just rely on my income. Let me just pay off all my stuff when it's due. No, you need to be looking at how to diversify your portfolio, how to gain more income streams. And so I don't have any beef with W-2 workers. I think that employees are vital to make everything work, and they are kind of what holds everything up. But kind of scaling that, going beyond that mindset, and even if you are technically an employee, going beyond that and gaining that entrepreneurial mindset, I think is vital. And especially in today's workforce, it can't be overlooked.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you mentioned something that just made me think about our recent show. I'm not sure if you listened to the Unstuck Economics with Bo Jacob, but he talks a lot about, in his book, Unstuck Economics, and on the show, about the importance of having different income streams. And I think that a lot of people talk about it, but I don't think a lot of people really put that into place or put that into action. And I think the easiest way maybe for, just for the listeners to think about that is, what happens if your major and in a lot of cases sole source of income goes to zero? What else do you have? And I think unfortunately the answer for most people is either nothing or not enough. So I absolutely agree with you there on building up multiple income streams. So let's see, are you still doing the Amazon business and some other e-commerce ventures, or what's, what is that? What do you envision income streams looking like for you? And I know you're only 21, but kind of over the coming decades, have you thought much about that?
Yes, I'm currently thinking I want to scale this into a business. But like I said, I don't think that's contradictory to working another job. I mean, I'm in college, I'm looking at what career opportunities there are, but also looking beyond that. This has been kind of a passion project for me. And so, yeah, I'm not too sure yet. I'm kind of opening my horizons and including lots of opportunities. But I mean, I would love to start more businesses in the future, and maybe businesses that kind of branch off from this or are connected in some other way. I think it's a very exciting world.
Yeah, and I'm excited for this. So, not to put you on the spot, but I guess I kind of am. I don't really have a choice here. Do you have an anticipated launch date for Aurum, or?
Yeah, so I'm currently building another side product that is sort of aligned with it, and that should launch within the next few months. So
Okay.
the holistic game, I mean, I have a pretty ambitious vision for this, and right now it's mostly me doing kind of all the heavy lifting. So it takes some time to actually develop something this complex, this holistic, and then put it out into the world to have beta testers and start getting users. So I'm looking at developing a smaller kind of offshoot of this and then integrating that into the whole thing as I get some more capital going.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, I was going to ask you. So you're obviously doing this and doing a lot of the heavy lifting, like you said. Are you also working with other people on this, other individuals, other peers maybe, or is this kind of a, hey, this is my project and I'm going to run with it?
Definitely the latter, though. I think it's so great to be starting a business while you're in university, because I have all my peers that are very entrepreneurial. They're all kind of working on their own things. And then in my bio, you mentioned that I was part of the Alpha Fellowship, and that is sort of a more ambitious, more bullish, you could say, like entrepreneurial think tank almost.
Gotcha.
It's me and some other classmates, and so we're all kind of working on our own ventures and then kind of scaling that together, but in different ways. We're all working on different things. And then at the University of Austin, we have what's called a Polaris project, and that's what everyone does. It's kind of the capstone project that you finish your senior year. You could start a business, you could write a book. It's very open, and it's just some super ambitious goal that you're working on the entire time that you're here.
Okay, awesome. All right. What haven't we asked you about that you'd like to share with the listeners? Anything at all that we didn't cover that you want to cover?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I guess I'll conclude with this. One of the biggest issues in finance, and I'm sure you've run into this before, is the issue of just misaligned incentives. Finance is one of the most consequential skills you'll ever learn. And money is the medium that we exist in, but most people don't actually understand its properties, and they're not taught. There are so many misaligned incentives. There are so many traps that people can fall into. And because it's money, everyone wants to take advantage of you. Banks want you for, using their products. NerdWallet, Credit Karma, all of these kind of affiliate search-based results want you for, who's going to pay for this credit card that they're recommending. And then, like we've talked about, Dave Ramsey, Robert Kiyosaki, these influencers want clicks. And then there's the issue of ed tech. So traditional platforms, they kind of optimize for compliance. They sell to schools. They don't really care about the user's long-term financial success. And so we're in this very complex world where there are so many misaligned incentives, and the average person, the average working American, becomes the victim of that. And so I think it's absolutely important that everyone learn personal finance for this reason. Everyone's targeting you, and almost no one has your best interests at heart. So I think learning personal finance and learning it as an entrepreneur is kind of the antidote to all of these problems.
Gotcha. And obviously this is probably a silly question, when Aurum, launches, obviously part of the answer is probably going to be, use the simulator, use the platform. But what other things besides listening to this podcast, like, would you recommend for the average person out there? Would it be reading books? Would it be peer groups? How can they kind of avoid, to the best of their ability, sort of these money traps that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the first thing would be educating yourself. I mean, without changing your income, without changing your expenses, the simplest thing you can do is just like look at your credit card report. You can look at where your money is going. You can see how you can optimize here, how you can, pull a little string there. I mean, I'm a big fan of comparison shopping too. I'm someone who loves fashion. I love travel, all of these things. And I'm also very frugal. So I think kind of looking around at what your best options are, finding clever ways to save money, whether that be buying secondhand, going to auctions, or just, cutting one thing in, I guess, substitution of another. I think it's very important that you look at things unconventionally. Everyone's like, cut the coffee out of your life, skip that $7 latte a day. And while that is true, I think there's more to it than that. And I think thinking outside the box and looking at these alternative options for how you can spend your money is a great place to start.
Gotcha. What's your opinion on, no pressure here, what's your opinion on financial advisors in general?
Sure, I haven't looked too deeply into them. I think from the little that I know, they can be helpful, but it seems like a very fragmented industry. You'll have your experts in taxes, you'll have your experts in, all of these very specific things, and they're not looking at the holistic individual. There's no real solution to the individual's holistic finances. That's what family offices are for, and that's what they do for the upper echelon of clients, but there's no real solution to that for the individual. So I think while they can be helpful, I think there's a certain element of caution that people should take in knowing that a lot of financial advisors kind of exist in their own echo chamber and they're not really coordinating with each other.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that's an industry-wide problem. This is probably a whole separate podcast, but it's a good point just to touch on briefly. I do think that that's an issue, in financial services. There are some smaller, typically, firms that are trying to solve for that. And there's mixed opinions on this. I've read different things and interacted with different people in different forums about, do you bring a tax practice into your financial services practice? Or if you have a tax practice, is it worth bringing on somebody that's in financial services, it's a CFP, for example? And so I think there are firms out there that are trying to sort of bridge some of those gaps, but I would agree with you that in general there is a lot to be desired there. You're going to have different people with different areas of expertise. Maybe you have one firm that's focused on retirement planning, but they're not necessarily focused on tax planning, or they're focused on retirement planning, but maybe they're not focused on some of the shorter term goals, or some of the estate planning things that could come up. And so yeah, there's actually, that was something that I talked about with a couple of advisor buddies of mine years ago. We were talking about, hey, should we kind of open up our own shop and kind of bring a lot of the stuff in-house and basically try to have a one-stop shop for clients where they can come in and meet with an estate planning attorney. And we have tax advisors that actually do tax planning, not just tax preparation, and have somebody that's doing some of their investment management, on that side of things. And there's not a lot of firms, to my knowledge, that exist out there doing it the way that it probably should be done, but I know that there are people trying to solve that issue. And I wish I could say I had the answer and that we launched something uber successful, but we haven't. We also work for the man, so to speak, but that's okay. We're doing some other things on the side as far as those income streams like we talked about a little while ago. But no, that's cool perspective. I was just curious. That's probably something that I'm going to start asking guests in general, just their opinion, because a lot of people, sometimes will have a good experience with an advisor, sometimes will have a not so great experience with an advisor, and it's just interesting to get different perspectives on that. So that's why I asked.
For sure.
All right. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I think I'm good. I think personal finance is a huge world. Lots of people are preying on you, and it's a very high stakes game that a lot of people are not prepared to play. So starting early, learning in an applied way, I think that's the most important thing anyone could do. All
right. And I know I mentioned this at the beginning of the show, but just to give you another shout out here, for those that are interested, you can go to Aurum, AURUM Financial, aurumfinancial.app, APP, for more information. you can check out the website, and just like we did with the show, and we're going to be eagerly awaiting to see what comes of everything, you can join the wait list and be notified of any new developments that Lucy and her team are working on. Thank you for coming on to the show today. We appreciate it, and we hopefully will have this out, I would say, sometime end of Q1 here, beginning of Q2 as far as today's show. So thanks for coming on.
Amazing. Thank you, Cashflow.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.